The desert was still. Not peaceful, just silent in a way that made everything feel forgotten. Matthew Callahan lay alone on the dry red earth, wrapped in a weathered sleeping bag, the last warmth of a small fire flickering beside him. Around him, the Arizona desert stretched wide and empty, broken only by the crooked silhouettes of towering saguaro cacti. It was his first night out here, in a place locals only called Deadland. No one came here willingly. But Matthew wasn't like most people anymore. He was 58 years old, a man whose face carried the kind of quiet sorrow you don't talk about at family dinners. He had driven out here with no clear plan, just a rifle, some gear, and a heart too heavy to carry any farther. His wife had passed last winter. His only daughter hadn't spoken to him in over a year. The silence of the desert matched the silence in his life. That's why he chose this place. He didn't expect company. He didn't want it. Sometime after midnight, the wind shifted. A dry, sudden gust pushed smoke from the dying fire across his face, waking him with a start. That's when he heard it, slow, deliberate steps crunching the sand. Not a coyote. Not a person. Something heavier. He didn't reach for his rifle. Something told him not to. As he lay still, eyes open and heart pounding, a shape emerged from the edge of the firelight. It was a horse. Tall. Muscular. Dust-covered. Untamed. Its eyes reflected the last orange glow of the fire, and it stepped closer with strange calm. Matthew's breath caught in his throat. There were no ranches for miles. No herds nearby. This horse didn't belong to anyone, and yet it didn't seem lost. It moved like it had been looking for something. Or someone. The horse lowered its head, nostrils flaring inches from Matthew's chest. He whispered without thinking. "You lost too." The horse didn't move. And then Matthew saw it, just below its left shoulder, a long, jagged scar. His body stiffened. That scar wasn't just familiar. It was identical to the one he remembered from a horse he had known decades ago. A horse that should have died. A horse connected to a day he'd spent years trying to forget. The wind howled suddenly, sending sparks into the sky. Matthew sat up slowly, staring at the animal, lips parted in disbelief. One word sat heavy on his tongue, but he couldn't say it, not yet. Because if this horse was real, then so was everything else he had buried in his past. Matthew didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat up in silence, watching the horse wander just beyond the ring of firelight, its figure moving like a ghost between the shadows of the cacti. Every few minutes it would pause and glance back at him, as if waiting for something. Recognition, maybe. He kept staring at that scar on its side. It wasn't just similar. It was exactly where it had been on him. On the horse he had once called Dusty, back when life was whole. But that was over 30 years ago, and Dusty had disappeared during a storm that destroyed everything. Back then, Matthew had been a different man. Young, stubborn, full of dreams that didn't include tragedy. He had inherited his father's ranch in northern Arizona and was known in town for his natural way with horses. Dusty had been his first real companion. Not just a working horse, but a bond, a connection to the land and to a time when things still felt hopeful. Losing him hadn't just been painful. It had been the beginning of a long unraveling that Matthew never truly stopped. Now, as the first light of dawn painted the desert gold, Matthew slowly stood, his legs stiff, his heart heavier than he wanted to admit. The horse didn't run. It watched him, calm, steady, with eyes that held something more than instinct. He stepped forward cautiously, unsure if it was real or if his mind was playing some cruel trick. The air was cold, and the silence between them felt like it carried 30 years of unanswered questions. "You can't be him," Matthew muttered under his breath. "You just can't." But part of him didn't believe that. Or maybe part of him wanted to believe. The horse stepped closer, and this time Matthew reached out a hand, slow, steady, like he'd done 1,000 times before. To his shock, the animal leaned forward, resting its nose briefly against his palm. It wasn't afraid. It wasn't wild. It was familiar. And in that one touch, Matthew felt something snap loose inside him, like a door long sealed had creaked open just enough to let in the air again. His throat tightened, but he swallowed it down. "Where did you come from?" he asked softly. The horse blinked slowly, and then, without warning, turned and began walking, not away, but toward the far edge of the desert, near the base of the hills. It paused, looked back, and waited. Matthew hesitated. Then, without thinking, he grabbed his canteen and rifle and followed. The horse moved with quiet certainty, as if it knew exactly where it was going. Matthew followed a few paces behind, boots crunching the brittle sand with every step. The sun was still low on the horizon, casting long shadows that danced between the cacti. His body ached from the cold ground, and the weight of the rifle on his shoulder felt heavier than usual. But it wasn't fatigue that slowed him, it was disbelief. Every part of this felt unreal, like walking through the memory of a dream he'd tried to forget. They crossed a dry wash, then a narrow ridge lined with pale stones. The horse paused occasionally, letting Matthew catch up, always watching him with those unreadable eyes. He studied every movement, every detail, searching for confirmation that this was his Dusty. But after 30 years, how could he be sure? Horses didn't live that long, at least not out here. Still, the scar, the temperament, the way it responded to his voice. Something inside him whispered, "Don't let this go." A mile out, they reached an area Matthew hadn't seen before. A shallow canyon cut through the land, with scattered brush and the skeletons of trees long dead from drought. The horse stopped near a twisted mesquite and lowered its head toward the ground. At first, Matthew thought it was grazing. But then he noticed tracks. Hoof prints. Recent. And not just from one horse. There had been others here. Multiple. Some small, some wide. He knelt beside them, brushing away the top layer of dust. The prints were fresh, no more than a day old. His chest tightened. This wasn't random. "What is this place?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. The horse didn't answer, of course, but it walked a few feet farther and then stopped again, near a half-buried wooden post. It was old, sun-bleached, cracked, and carved. Matthew squinted in the morning light and saw the faint outline of a letter, C. Then another, L. A chill ran through him. These letters were familiar. They matched the old branding iron from his father's ranch, Callahan Livestock. But that ranch had burned to the ground in '93. He stood slowly, dust clinging to his jeans, his heart pounding with a question he hadn't dared ask in years. Could something from the old ranch have survived? Livestock? People? Before he could think further, the horse suddenly raised its head, ears twitching. It stared into the distance, and Matthew heard it too. The faint, distant sound of another horse, running. The sound grew louder, fast, rhythmic hoofbeats pounding against the earth. Matthew turned instinctively toward the source, heart thudding in sync with whatever was approaching. The horse beside him, Dusty, or whatever this creature truly was, stood still, alert but unafraid. That calmness unnerved him even more. Whatever was coming, it didn't scare the horse. But Matthew couldn't say the same for himself. He gripped the stock of his rifle but didn't raise it. The last thing he wanted was to fire at something he didn't understand. The hoofbeats echoed through the canyon walls, bouncing and merging with the wind until the direction became hard to pin down. Then, suddenly, they stopped. Silence fell again, heavy and complete. Even the wind held its breath. Matthew scanned the landscape, searching for movement, any sign of another rider, or a wild animal, or a trick of the wind. But there was nothing. Only the tracks in the dirt and the strange weight of old memories pressing down on him. His thoughts turned back to the post, the one marked with his family's brand. How had it survived? The fire had been total. He'd watched the barn collapse in flames, watched horses scatter into the night. Some had died. Others were never found. Dusty among them. And yet, here stood a horse that matched him in every way, leading him to a place he hadn't seen in decades. And now, hoofbeats from the past? What was this? A message? A memory brought to life? Matthew exhaled slowly, the dry air burning his throat. He felt foolish. Maybe grief was finally catching up to him. Maybe the loneliness had cracked something open inside. But something told him to keep going. He walked past the carved post, stepping deeper into the canyon. More wooden beams jutted from the dirt ahead, broken fencing, twisted wire, and bits of old rope. This had been a corral, long ago. He was standing in what was once part of the ranch's southern grazing land. Then he saw something that stopped him cold. Half buried under sand and brush was a wooden sign, barely legible. He knelt and cleared it with his hand. The paint was faded, but the words were still there. Callahan Ranch, SD 1951. Matthew stared at it, breathless. This wasn't just a random piece of land. He had stumbled onto the last piece of his family's legacy, one he hadn't even known still existed. And just as the weight of that realization hit him, the silence shattered again, this time not from hooves, but from a voice. A man's voice, rough and close. "Who the hell are you?" Matthew turned sharply, eyes locking onto the figure that had appeared just beyond the rusted remains of a fence post. The man stood tall, shoulders squared, with a rifle slung across his chest and a hard stare that could carve into stone. He looked about Matthew's age, late 50s, maybe early 60s, but rougher, as if the desert itself had raised him. His clothes were dusty, sun-bleached, and torn in places that suggested more labor than leisure. The man stepped forward slowly, boots crunching over old bones and dry brush. "I said, 'Who the hell are you?'" the stranger repeated, his voice lower now, but no less sharp. Matthew lifted his hands slightly, not in fear, but out of instinct. "Name's Matthew Callahan," he replied evenly. "I used to live out here, long time ago." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a second neither of them spoke. Dusty stood silently nearby, ears twitching, watching the exchange with eerie calm. It was as if the horse recognized the man too. The stranger took another step forward, then stopped just a few feet away. "Callahan?" he echoed, suspicion rising in his tone. "You're lying. The Callahans left this place for dead after the fire. Ain't been no one here in 30 years. His hand rested on the grip of his rifle now. Matthew noticed, but didn't react. He understood this kind of caution. Desert men didn't welcome surprise visitors, especially not ones walking through old ruins with ghosts still clinging to the walls. "I'm not here to claim anything," Matthew said, voice steady. "I didn't even know this was still standing. I came out here to be alone. That horse brought me to this spot. I didn't plan any of this." The man glanced at Dusty, and for the first time something flickered in his expression. Recognition. He stepped slowly toward the horse, who didn't move. "I've seen this one before," he muttered. "He wanders these parts now and then. Never lets anyone near him. Never gets caught. Just watches." He looked back at Matthew. "You're the first one I've seen him bring in." A heavy silence fell again, broken only by the soft whistle of the wind through the broken fence. Matthew studied the man's face, something tugging at the edge of his memory. There was a familiarity in the way he stood, the way he spoke. Then the man said, quieter now, almost like he didn't want to believe it himself, "You're Joseph's boy, aren't you?" Matthew didn't answer right away. The name, Joseph, hung in the air like smoke, thick with memory and weight. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years. Not like that. not with that mixture of anger and disbelief. His father's name. A name tied to this land, to broken promises, and to a fire that still burned behind his eyes every time he let himself remember. He took a slow breath and nodded. "Yeah," he said finally. "Joseph Callahan was my father." The man stepped back slightly, eyes narrowing. Whatever anger had flared moments ago was now tempered by something deeper. Grief, maybe, or disappointment long buried. "I figured," he muttered. "You've got his jaw. Same way of standing like the weight of the world's on your back." He looked off toward the horizon for a moment, like he was measuring time. "He and we didn't part on good terms. Matthew didn't push. There was pain there, old pain, and too many stories behind it to unpack all at once." "Not many people did," he replied. "My father, he wasn't easy. But he loved this place. He poured everything into it. It killed him when it all burned down." The stranger said nothing, but his jaw tightened. The fire. The night that changed everything. Matthew remembered the flames, the screaming horses, the smoke that swallowed the sky. No one ever proved how it started. Some said lightning. Others whispered about sabotage. But Matthew had always wondered if there was more to it. The man finally spoke again. "Name's Clay. Clay Hawthorne. My father worked these lands alongside yours. Until the fire. After that, we stayed. Sort of. Everyone else left. We didn't have the money to move, and something about this place—" He shook his head. "It won't let go." Dusty let out a slow breath, as if agreeing. Clay glanced at the horse again, and his voice dropped. "That horse? You called him Dusty? My father said your dad used to say that was his favorite. The only one he'd trust alone on the trails." He looked back at Matthew, his expression shifting from suspicion to quiet awe. "That was over 30 years ago. If this is the same horse, that's not natural." Matthew nodded slowly. "I know." Then Clay said something that made Matthew's chest tighten. "Your father wasn't just running a ranch, Matthew. He was hiding something out here. Something no one was supposed to find." Matthew's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Clay didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the old canyon trail, jaw tense. "You want the truth? You follow me." Clay didn't say another word as he turned and began walking down the narrow canyon trail, his boots kicking up dust with each step. Matthew hesitated, glancing back at Dusty, who had already begun to follow without being told. The air was warming, but the cold in Matthew's chest hadn't left. There was a feeling he couldn't shake, like he was walking toward something he wasn't ready to face. Still, he moved. One step at a time, same as his father used to do when the burden was too heavy to carry all at once. The trail narrowed, curving around rock formations like forgotten tombstones. Clay walked with purpose, like a man who'd traveled this path 100 times but never with someone else beside him. Matthew could feel the weight in the silence. There was more here than old land and dust. There were memories trapped in the cracks of the stone. Whispers. Regrets. His father's shadow lingered in the air, thick and unresolved. They came to a clearing hidden between two high ridges. Faded boards outlined what looked like an old storage shed, mostly collapsed. Rusted tools were scattered across the ground, half swallowed by time. Clay stopped and pointed to the ground near one of the walls. "There," he said. "My father used to bring me out here when I was a boy. Told me never to tell anyone about this place. Said it belonged to Joseph, and that it held something dangerous." Matthew stepped forward slowly. His boots crunched over dry leaves and brittle wood. At first, all he saw was debris. But then, under a sheet of warped metal, a trapdoor. Hidden. Locked with a rusted chain and an old padlock. His chest tightened. "What's down there?" he asked, voice quiet. Clay shook his head. "I never saw. My father wouldn't let me close. But I heard stories, late-night conversations, whispers about deals, government men, and something your father swore he'd take to the grave." He paused, his face tense. "Whatever it is, Joseph wanted it buried." Matthew stared at the lock, his mind racing. His father was many things, hard, proud, distant, but secretive most of all. What could he have hidden here, beneath the dirt of a dying ranch? And why had it remained untouched all these years? He knelt, brushing sand from the edges of the trapdoor. The metal was cold despite the sun. Dusty stood just a few feet behind, silent as a statue. Then Matthew looked up at Clay. "You got something to break this lock?" Clay nodded once and turned to retrieve a crowbar from the brush. The crowbar groaned against the rusted lock, the sound sharp and grating in the canyon's silence. Clay gritted his teeth as he leaned into the effort. With a loud snap, the padlock gave way, falling into the dirt like a broken relic of the past. Matthew stared at it for a long second. That lock had kept something buried for over 3 decades, and now, in a few seconds, the truth was suddenly within reach. Together, they pulled the warped metal back and lifted the trapdoor. A cold breath of air rushed out, damp and earthy, like a tomb opening for the first time in years. A narrow wooden staircase descended into darkness. Clay grabbed an old lantern from his satchel, lit it with shaking hands, and handed it to Matthew. The light flickered, casting uneven shadows on the jagged stone walls below. Without a word, Matthew started down. Each step creaked beneath his boots, and the air grew heavier as he descended. The space wasn't large, just a dugout room beneath the canyon floor, reinforced with timber beams and lined with dust-covered crates and metal shelves. Old tools, maps, and notebooks were scattered everywhere, preserved like someone had planned to come back, but never did. Matthew set the lantern on a flat rock and turned in a slow circle, trying to absorb what he was seeing. Clay entered behind him, voice low. "We always thought it was just storage. But when I was 16, I snuck down here. What I saw didn't make sense. Your father had files, photos, letters, documents stamped with government seals. Stuff way beyond cattle and fences." He pointed to a file cabinet rusted nearly shut. "And something else. That scared my old man enough to say we were never to speak of this again." Matthew stepped toward the corner where a canvas tarp lay stretched over something large. His pulse quickened. With both hands, he pulled the tarp away, revealing a sealed metal crate marked with faded military stencils, "Property of U.S. Government. Do not open." He stared at it, stunned. "Why would my father have this?" Clay's face was pale. "I told you. He was hiding something." Matthew moved closer and saw a folder tucked beneath the crate. He opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, black and white images of men in uniform, desert test sites, strange antennas, and then a familiar face. His father. Younger. Standing beside a general. Smiling. Matthew's hands trembled. This wasn't just a ranch. Clay nodded, voice hollow. "No. It was a cover." Matthew sat on the dirt floor, the folder still open in his lap, unable to take his eyes off the photos. His father looked so different, confident, almost proud, standing beside men in uniform under the desert sun. These weren't casual pictures. They were official, coordinated, planned. And if the government crate beside him was real, then everything he thought he knew about his father, about the ranch, about the fire, was a lie. He flipped to the next page. A memo. Dated 1968. Stamped, "Top Secret." The words blurred as he read, his mind struggling to grasp the implications. It spoke of experimental field activity, classified technology, and most disturbingly, civilian containment in the event of breach. Matthew's stomach turned. His father hadn't just been hiding something for the government. He'd been part of it. A willing participant. "I thought my father was just a hard man," Matthew whispered, eyes still locked on the page. "But he was involved in something way beyond ranching. Clay, this land was never about cattle." Clay stood on the other side of the room, arms crossed tightly. He'd read some of the documents, too, but it was clear he didn't want to believe what they were saying. "My dad always told me your father was a man with secrets. I just thought it meant gambling, debts, the kind of stuff men hide. But this—" He motioned to the crate. "Whatever's in there, it's not meant for anyone to see." Matthew placed the file down and approached the crate again. There was a smaller lock, but it had rusted through. With effort, he pried it open. The hinges screamed, protesting the years. Inside, padded in foam, lay a metallic device, shaped like a horseshoe but embedded with dials and copper wiring. It looked ancient and advanced at the same time, like it didn't belong to any known era. Alongside it was a document with his father's signature. Project Dustline. That word hit him like a hammer. Dusty. The name of the horse. The name of the project. It wasn't a coincidence. "He named the horse after the project," Matthew muttered. "But why?" Clay looked at Dusty, who now stood just at the edge of the trapdoor, calm as always, watching. "You think he's connected to it?" Matthew didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because deep down, something in him had already shifted. Dusty wasn't just leading him to the past. He was protecting it. The device lay cold and silent in Matthew's hands, but its presence filled the underground room with a strange weight. Not fear exactly, but significance. Whatever Project Dustline had been, it was now clear it had involved more than machines or research. It had involved people, animals, loyalty, silence. Matthew looked up at Dusty, standing still at the top of the stairs, sunlight framing his body like something sacred. He wasn't just a horse. He was part of it. A witness. Maybe even the last living remnant of a secret too old to speak. Clay paced in the shadows, visibly unsettled. "So what now? We bring this to the authorities? The media? Just let the world decide what it means." He shook his head. "Whatever your father was hiding, he took it underground for a reason." Matthew set the device back into its case, careful and slow, as if closing a chapter too painful to keep open. "No," he said. "This isn't for the world. It never was. My father didn't do this for glory. He did it to protect something. Maybe someone. And Dusty," he turned to the horse. "He never left this place. Never forgot it. Maybe he's been waiting all this time, for someone to come finish what my father started." Clay looked at him, brow furrowed. "You're telling me this horse remembered all of that? Protected it?" Matthew nodded. "I don't know how, but yes. Horses don't carry hatred or greed. They carry loyalty, memory. He came back here for a reason. Led me here for a reason." His voice softened. "He didn't just survive. He waited. For me." The words caught in his throat, but he let them out anyway. "My father never told me who he really was. But Dusty did." Without saying a word. Together, they sealed the trapdoor again, leaving the secrets beneath the earth, untouched but understood. Not buried in shame, but in peace. The past didn't need to be erased, just remembered. And guarded. Matthew stood at the canyon's edge hours later, watching as the sun began its slow descent across the desert sky. Clay rode off in silence, promising to tell no one. The bond had been made, and respected. Dusty stood beside Matthew, the wind gently lifting his mane. For the first time in years, Matthew felt whole. Not because he had uncovered some government secret, or because he had found answers, but because he had found purpose. In grief. In truth. In legacy. He climbed onto Dusty's back without fear, like he had done as a boy. And together they rode into the fading light, not to escape the past, but to carry it forward.